My name is Reynaldo Anderson. I'm chair of the Humanities Department at Harris-Stowe State University. I'm also the executive director and creative director for the Black Speculative Arts Movement. I will not have the panache and whining that Lewis had, nor will I be as elegant as Kojo in terms of how he presents his information. Every time I hear Kojo speak, I wish he had been my English teacher when I was in high school. I would have developed better subject-verb agreement in terms of the way I write, the way Kojo talks. And as I was sharing with them, if Afrofuturism were Hogwarts, as Professor Anderson, I'd be representing House Slytherin, okay, in terms of how is it explained and dealt with, because I tend to deal with the socio-political context that leads to how these ideas are formed. One of the things I want to talk about in relation to my title, I would say out of statements like Zbigniew Brzezinski in 2008 when he made the statement, it's easier to kill 1 million people than to govern 1 million people. Now, because of the contemporary technology that governments use to control their citizens, that was an eye-opening, revealing thought by a member of the elite in America. And then shortly after he made that statement, I think he was sent away to the quiet room for telling the truth in public. They didn't let him speak too much after that. I tend to be a little bit more, I'm not going to deal so much with the musical aspect of Afrofuturism, which I say it is a component in terms of maybe aesthetics. I deal with several general themes related to it, and I'm going to walk you all through this in terms of where Afrofuturism as a movement is now in terms of how it's expanding. In the 21st century, Afrofuturism is emerging as a Pan-African, transdisciplinary techno-cultural movement with planetary goals and is guided by a long-term interstellar vision. The convergence of Afrofuturism and Pan-Africanism is the result of how global Black life in the last 500 years has been marked by 3 critical points in world history, including the transatlantic and Arab slave trade, whereby African people were transformed into human commodities and human money, and the literary record of their experiences demanding full status as full human beings that were punctuated by revolution or rebellion and market globalization, environmental collapse, and digital technologies. And I'm citing that from Sheila Bembe's work and Segel. Furthermore, the global racial contract for Black life during this time has progressed from slavery and colonialism to neocolonialism and systematic racism in relation to international white supremacy. Moreover, these actions by overlapping diasporas, you not only have the Black Atlantic, you also have the white Atlantic, from the Western Hemisphere to Europe and Africa to maintain racial hegemony through statecraft, international finance, and military force. Finally, this notion of racial hegemony is extended into the imaginations of future time for the white Atlantic, whether by literature or cinema productions, such as the movie Interstellar, whiteness is formed against a black shadow. This is representative of a state of affairs where early in the 21st century, the survival of Africa and its diaspora in a hostile 21st century social Darwinistic environment in the midst of massive climate change and technological acceleration requires a reaffirmation of, from the Black radical tradition, a nationalist approach and transnational ethics informed by a critical Afrofuturist sensibility and Pan-African praxis to forecast, guide, and frame a strategic plan for Black survival. Previously, in 1906, the science fiction writer H.G. Wells noted the social problems in America from his writing desk. He said, "What is going to happen in the United States of America in the next 30 years or so?" In the body of the text, Wells attempted to forecast the social relations of the former masters and the former slaves. And among his musings suggested, after meeting Booker T. Washington, believed he was more statesmanlike than the seer prophet W.E.B. Du Bois. More recently, last year in 2016, the United Nations issued a report in support of reparations for African descendants, echoing the 19th century sentiments of Alexis de Tocqueville, noting that the legacy of white supremacy will ensure that the United States of America will not be a socially cohesive society now or into the foreseeable future. Now, where does art, speculative design, and futurity and leadership intersect? Now, a few years ago, as I mentioned previously, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and during that time, that is when the Ferguson Rebellion broke out. And some of you may have heard a young man named Michael Brown was killed and left his body in the street for hours, laying in the street. And his uncle was in my English class that fall. And a lot of my students were involved with the protest, dealing with tear gas, rubber bullets, and so forth. And this is where the young people came to the conclusion that they indicted the entire system, both Democratic parties and Republican, despite the fact that they had a black president. And so this is where the youth started rejecting some of the traditional ways or thoughts and ideas that had been passed on to them in terms of how to deal with social protests. This is where I think I wrote an essay at the time, it was called Ferguson Future Shock, where the changes that were going on in terms of globalization, and by 2014, this is still where the market crash of '08 and its recovery had never reached people on the margins in terms of the wealth that citizens had lost the previous several years, jobs that left and did not come back. And this unrest, along with social media, exposed the fact that the ongoing problem of police brutality in America in the system which some people like Ava DuVernay and other scholars refer to as the new Jim Crow, in terms of where you have over 1 million people of African descent tied up with the criminal justice system, a lot of times in private prison complexes in order to monetize their bodies for profit. One of the things they also revealed were some of the things that I saw with the left in relation to politics around the Ferguson Rebellion. And I make the argument that if the right-wing conservatives frequently argue about trickle-down economics, that the left frequently practices trickle-down ideology. And a lot of times, a lot of things I know about the left and some of my friends that think of themselves as leftists is sometimes the left, in terms of how their ideology works, they'd rather lose nobly than win ugly. And I suppose this comes from the perspective as being somewhat of a pragmatist. And in full disclosure, I'm fourth-generation American military, which is why I kind of identify with John Boyega's character in Star Wars. Being a Marine Corps or a former Imperial stormtrooper, I understand what the system is capable of and what it's willing to do, and how your consciousness, reading this through Fanon, you are transformed in training how to do violence on other people's bodies. And the American military is very effective at that. Forerunners of what we call Afrofuturism, or as I was in a conversation recently with Cheryl Vint, who's a Marxist sci-fi critic, and she kind of agreed with me. We're maybe starting to move in the direction of calling it just black speculative thought. That you can trace a lot of these ideas back to the 19th century, where if you are an enslaved person, to imagine freedom at that time is purely speculative. And in the imaginations of people like Martin Delany before the Civil War, and the actions of formerly enslaved Africans that end up establishing the first black countries in the modern world system, such as Sierra Leone and Liberia, and very much influenced by the imagination and actions of the Haitian Revolution, they had demonstrated that slaves could establish a modern state. And this kind of flies in the face of European philosophy that did not believe that slaves had the ability to run a modern society. Interestingly enough, this, like Pauline Hopkins, the writer, whose book of One Blood also deals with this perspective of relating back to Africa. And some of their writings are in the age of social Darwinism, or what people were even calling race science in the 19th century. In Europe, a lot of these ideas of race science were tied to the presence of the Jewish population that was in Europe at the time. And Du Bois's idea of the souls of black folk that he develops in 1906, which are in some ways related to his study that he learned about in relation to German philosophy while studying at, I believe it's Humboldt University at that time. Because he's, as a mature, at this time in his ideological development, is probably maybe a democratic liberal in terms of trying to figure out, okay, with this population, how do you build a nation of people that are basically 35, 40 years removed from chattel slavery? The idea of the sonic color line. A book came out recently that is very interesting to me by Jennifer Stover, where it talks about the essentialist ideas about black sounds and listening offered white elites a new method of grounding racial abjection in the body while cultivating as a critical, discerning, and delicate, and above all, as the standard for citizenship and personhood. Now, in contemporary terms, I was in discussion with Louis and Kojo and Angelica, and I was talking about when you watch modern award programs, depending how your ear listens to the music, how could you vote for Taylor Swift over Kanye West? You know, Prince not winning more awards than he should have won. Or as I think, or how does Adele beat Beyonce's creativity with Lemonade? You know, in terms of the ear is just as important as the visual, and frequently what you listen to is reinforcing what you visually see and think about. But about the sonic color line, what I think where Sun Ra and underground resistance are important as it relates to the sound and blackness and race, I'm arguing that Sun Ra and underground resistance as interstellar fugitives, and Sun Ra thinking about being from Saturn, what they're doing is enlarging what Lewis Gordon calls the geography of reason in terms of establishing identity beyond the planetary Earth, where previously Sun Ra talked about blackness or black people as myths. And he brings in this idea of myth science. Okay, now, what I'm arguing right now, because along with Afrofuturism, you have other aspects of futurity emerging around the world now. And I first talked about this in Israel this spring when I was addressing some Palestinian and Jewish intellectuals at a conference hosted by Tohu magazine outside Jerusalem. And I talked about dark speculative futurity, the late 20th century and early 21st development, emergence, and philosophical maturity of non-white people in regards to these items I put here in terms of forecasting phenomena of their cultural purpose, principles, and goals in regards to global change. And this is emerging in the context of what Ian Bremmer calls a G0 world. From the early 90s when they used to talk about the G7 and then you had the G20, all the G0 means there's no common ground amongst global powers, and none of them have the political or economic ability to remake the status quo on their own. America is no longer the sole hegemonic power in the world. And I don't know if I'd wanted to have hegemonic power with somebody like Donald Trump as its leader, which is probably a good thing. But it's basically a situation where you have every nation and every group for itself in a G0 environment. One of the things also that I relate to in terms of this and how this current time zone or this current location where I'm now, I remember watching, while I'm working on a lot of these concepts the last few years, I was very much a fan of when the Greek people were rebelling against German bankers. Because at the same time that the Southern European countries were being blamed for problems in the European Union, the economic collapse initially in the United States was blamed on people of color in the housing market, because bankers hired people to promote these products in minority communities, knowing they were not good products, in order to inflate the money in pockets of hedge fund managers. So the same thing that happened to the people of Greece or Portugal or Southern Europe was done to minorities in North America as it relates to the housing market. What is Afrofuturism? To understand what it is or the context it emerges in, I started referring to look at it instead as a set of ideas or a concept that emerges at the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, because Barbara Christensen wrote an article called The Race for Theory in the late 80s, talking about as the Cold War ended and apartheid was clearly coming to an end, there were several theories that were starting to be promoted, at least in the North American context, related to ideas such as Molefi Asante's The Afrocentric Idea, Skip Gates' The Signifying Monkey, Cornel West's work, Race Matters, Bell Hooks as a black feminist theoretician, and Mark Derry is a part of that generation of scholars who are trying to come up with a concept to explain what is happening as personal computers were beginning to transform American life. The economy is transforming at that time, and so he's among a set of a dozen scholars that are trying to come up with ideas and theories to explain this transition in American society. And so this is where, based on an interview that he has with Greg Tate, who's a cultural theorist and critic, Samuel Delaney, the science fiction author, whose work is undervalued really as a foundational element of Afrofuturism, in my opinion, and Trisha Rose, who had written a book related to the development and emergence of hip-hop, I believe I recall is referred to as Black Noise. And for lack of a better term, which I know my friend Eric and other people might tease him about sometimes, he calls it Afrofuturism, when he observed this relationship between blacks and technology. However, at that time, Mark was unaware of the larger and longer black speculative tradition that went back 150 years, which maybe in a broader context, it should be called black speculative thought. One of the weaknesses that I talk about of these earlier formulations of Afrofuturism, and I commented on my book 2.0 and other talks, is this idea of dwelling primarily in imaginary spaces. Okay, in terms of, and Ron Eglish was one of the first people, and not the only person to comment on this thing, where these imaginary spaces in literature or music tend to be the dominant aspect of the 1.0 perspective. However, the material aspect or critique was largely grounded in this idea of the digital divide in the 90s, which dealt with the access of minorities to technology such as the internet. His second weakness was a limited knowledge of futurism or future studies. That's why when I get calls or interviews now, I'm like, okay, do you know who Marinetti was? Have you looked at this stuff? And if they say no, okay, I'll say read and come back and call me later. Because one of the things is having a knowledge of what is futurism or the idea of future studies done by people, organizations such as the RAND Corporation and other entities like that that have been going on for decades now, or what some people now call foresight studies. A third weakness being a limited knowledge of Africa and its traditions, because it, as was previously stated by Lewis, tended to be too American-centric, but I would say that is not necessarily so much a cultural bias, but the limitations of the American public school system. A fourth weakness being a geographical parochialism that influences weak philosophical practice. And then fifth, a Eurocentric perspective related to early formulations of Afrofuturism that had wondered if the history had been erased, and too many previous commentaries a little more than European studies of Afrofuturism. Now, the themes of what I called second wave Afrofuturity have emerged in the last several years, and when I say second wave, I'm arguing that the second wave of Afrofuturity really can kind of be benchmarked between 2005, which is the emergence of social media, Facebook, followed by Twitter, and social media platforms that allowed for people to engage with each other across the entire Atlantic basin, exchanging ideas, art, increasingly, whether it's currency and transactions like that, are accelerated during this time. And it's characterized by these 5 elements that I believe are worthy of investigation in terms of, and I'll get a little more specific here. When we talk about, and I define Afrofuturism 2.0, but I'll get that into the next slide, but I'm going to deal with these 5 themes first. These dimensions include metaphysics, and this dimension includes or engages ontology, or the meaning of existence, relations between ontological and epistemological or truth-functional aspects of knowledge, cosmogony or origin of the universe, cosmology or structure of the universe. An example of this are naturalistic Afro-diaspora traditions, rational panpsychism or animism, and indigenous African spiritual practices, which I won't get into all the examples, but a lot of philosophers, whether you're looking at John Mbidi, Kamal Braithwaite, Kwesi Wiredu, Yvonne Chouinard, or Dwight Hopkins. The second dimension of aesthetics, which is the most popular one that people tend to be aware of in relation to music and visual art, are examples in music and literature, and include performers or artists and theorists like a Sylvia Wynter or a Sanford Biggers, Sun Ra, Henry Dumas, John Akomfrah, Africa Bambaataa, or John Akins or Derek May. And the third dimension in the area of theoretical and applied science, such as archaeology, math, physics, chemistry, and architecture, which I'll have an example of the architecture stuff because I don't have enough time to go through all these other examples. And examples of architecture or ethno-astronomer Jarita Holbrook, or the use of African Adinkra symbols in relations to physics now. Also in the area, a fourth dimension being in social science disciplines, to include sociology, anthropology, psychology, political science, where you come across the ideas of a Kwame Nkrumah, or a Dorothy Roberts, or a C.T. Quito, Marimba Ani, Alex Wahelia, or Kelly Tao. And a fifth and final dimension being programmatic areas, or you might call another form of applied programmatic areas, like the work that Rasheedah Phillips does with the Afrofuturist Affair in Philadelphia around the politics of time and working class people. And also where some of us here that are here in the room met each other at the Afrofutures UK conference a couple years in Manchester. Myself, Eric, Rasheedah, all of us met each other for the first time here in Europe a couple years ago. Now 2.0, in terms of what it's grappling with now, this idea of the neo-nationalism and what Nick Land called the Dark Enlightenment. And this is where I define 2.0 distinctly from the 1.0 version, talking about this, using Catherine Hale's work, this idea of technogenesis of black identity, counter-histories, appropriating network software, enhancement and augmentation, gender fluidity, and the speculative sphere with transdisciplinary applications. And this is where it has now grown into a Pan-African phenomenon. However, I would also couch that, that there are also two emerging different schools of thought in this second wave of Afrofuturism, primarily driven by British scholars and thinkers about the discussion and by scholars in North America. And the other aspect of it being heavily concentrated in the Anglophone world for obvious reasons and structural reasons, since both America and British are, former empires, and they have far-flung, whether it's through former colonies or military bases, that seems to be the structural basis for a lot of this Anglophone dominance. However, other linguistic formations, whether they're Francophone, Lusophone, and others, are now dealing with this concept. And the other thing, neo-nationalism. Now, in the United States, whether you read Foreign Policy and other journals that the elites read, or even at the popular cultural level, clearly neo-nationalism is the driving force in global politics at the moment. Donald Trump is a nationalist, Putin is a nationalist, the leader of China is a nationalist in Japan, so the leaders of all the largest economies in the world are nationalists. And it characterized by Brexit, Trumpism, and so forth. Now, in a conversation that I had with one of the think tanks here a few weeks ago, I said I wasn't sad about Brexit happening because I thought the weakening of the British Commonwealth would set into motion a bunch of dominoes that would ultimately free Africa from the crown, okay? So as far as I'm concerned, as Afrofuturist, Brexit was good. If they were stupid enough to shoot themselves in the foot like that, more power to them. One of the things H.G. Wells said early in the 20th century is that Europe could not survive without being able to dominate Africa. When you go to Africa in the Francophone world, they still use the CFA franc, so I will be happy when that collapse happens also. I will light a birthday cake or something when they finally do that. And then also this idea of the Dark Enlightenment coined by Nick Land, this idea of a techno-libertarian determinism characterized by reactionaries and neo-social Darwinism. In anticipation of my talk today, I tweeted to Nick Land last night talking about Donald Trump was the president Nick Land wanted, and he responded, no, his choice was Hillary Clinton, I'm still with her. So, one of the vehicles that's carrying forth this idea of the second wave of Afrofuturism is the Black Speculative Art movement. And the Black Speculative Arts movement is something that grew out of an exhibition that we had that ended in New York last January and started in the fall of 2015. And the event was the Unveiling Visions, Alchemy of the Black Imagination project that was co-curated by Don Jennings and myself, where we were looking at how, in the midst of what's going on now, do we restoke the fire in the Black imagination? John, he likes referring to the book that came out in the 60s called Black Fire. And he's saying, his argument is what we've done in this project is recreate some of the things that happened with Black Fire in the 60s with what we're doing with visual art and the essays and poetry and other work that's coming along with it. And we've in just 18 months, we've expanded into an international movement now, along working with Maya Williams of the MeccaCon Festival. It's like a traveling Comic-Con in terms of where we look at an Afrofuturism that's built from popular culture, and we're building it from the ground up based upon local tastes as it relates to Black futurity. So when we do an event in Canada, it looks very different when we did it in Montreal than when we did it out in LA with people from Hollywood this spring. And we are going to be doing it in Europe next year in Berlin next fall, and at that time we're hoping to expand while we're in Berlin, go to London and Paris. Following, this is an example of what maybe Black speculative art looks like into architecture. This is the African American Museum that opened recently on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The architect is David Adjaye, and David Adjaye talks about using different elements from African culture to construct this. And what's so neat about it, besides that copper iron that surrounds it, you can tell it's clearly like the Black People's Monument there on the National Mall, because all of the other buildings are white. Even though all those structures, many of them were built by slaves, such as the White House, this is kind of like the Black folks in America. This is our National Museum, and in there you can go and see all kinds of items from all parts of Africa, the Caribbean, all parts of the diaspora in Europe in terms of, now we tried really, really hard to keep Clarence Thomas from being represented in the museum at the time, but we lost that struggle because the Republicans and conservatives felt that we did not have enough people, I guess, representing their ideology. So I think they gave him a small space somewhere in there to note his presence. One of these things, as a person with a somewhat, I'm kind of forecasting a somewhat dystopian future where the future is being driven by the people at the margins in terms of how they're going to use technology to survive. I'm looking at the architect Olalekan Jeyifus and Nnedi Okorafor his work. Nnedi Okorafor being a Nigerian-American author and a fan of her literary talent in terms of what her book, Who Fears Death, which is going to be a series on HBO next year. You know, and I found that out watching Game of Thrones. I'm a big Game of Thrones fan. I tend to be a fan of Arya Stark. I just like Arya. And and I believe that depiction of these two pieces here kind of represent the visions of the architect and that literary aspect that Nnedi puts out. Because one of the arguments I've made in recent years that I thought that the future expansion of Afrofuturism was going to be with continental Africans, as Lewis talked about himself. Now, they're interested in futurity, while we are more interested in maybe an inspiration from our roots. They're thinking of futurity, of they can actualize it in terms of building institutions and how this is fashioned based upon their own location, where they are. And I want to play this short clip here of Olalekan's idea of architecture in terms of how slums are frequently viewed as unsightly eyesores, and how this occurs from Chicago to Rio de Janeiro and throughout the world. All right, so one of the things, as I was alluding to earlier, in Africa, when I first gave my first lecture on Afrofuturism in Ghana 3 years ago, they're really looking for practical application, okay, in terms of how do we apply this to our existing infrastructure that we are in charge of here. And so one of the things for an Afrofuturist leadership and imagination across the diaspora are 3 things that I say are necessary, whether you're dealing with the imagination or applied science. You got to have foresight, seeing where things are headed, insight, understanding why things are happening, and then oversight, kind of having the same way you have GPS on your phone, looking at how things are connected with everything. And then how will they respond to the 3 forces driving global change: globalization, technological acceleration, and climate change. Because one of the things that I tried to talk about when I was in Israel and on visiting the West Bank this spring, the new G0 environment means that people in that country are going to have to figure out how they're going to solve their problems. Because I pointed out the West has been both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim. And people in North America are not going to continue to finance their bickering with each other. And they're no longer interested in sending their young people to go over and manage the conflict. And pretty soon, Western countries, whether it's Great Britain, France, the United States, are no longer going to have the resources to stay in that region of the world, because their domestic problems in terms of how they deal with that are going to overtake them fairly quickly. So, if you're talking about more challenges for Black speculative design and Pan-African futurity, this idea of recolonization being a real thing, one of the things where artists and writers can grapple with this, as I was talking with Kojo and some other people last night, Tende Huchu's The Sale, a short story, emphasizes the ways current BRIC nations, BRIC meaning Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, their investment in Africa reiterates colonial power relations, rendering development synonymous with the extraction of surplus value from pacified Bantustans, where a country like Zimbabwe is then controlled in a joint fashion by China and Russia in co-production. And that's not necessarily imaginary anymore. China and America are already in co-production around cinema. So, and a lot of times, and enough critical theorists have talked about the relationship in critical studies between media and politics. I always tell people, and other people have said this is not an original thought. If you always want to see who America's enemy is, watch a James Bond movie, okay? A generation ago, it was the Russians. And now it's been, in recent iterations of the James Bond character, it seems to have been either people who are from the Muslim world or the Asian world. So those movies serve as signposts for who we should look at as people who are messing with America's stuff, and that Great Britain has to shepherd our way through MI6. So, are we headed toward a convergence of politics, culture, and futurity? Or are we moving toward a clash of futurities, kind of a take on Samuel Huntington's idea of the clash of civilizations, and the need for interstellar Black power? A recent book out, The Nigerian Space Program and the History, Present, and Future of Space Policy in Sub-Saharan Africa and Geopolitics, is emerging in terms of, most people don't know that an African country was one of the first signatories to space law, which was written in the 60s. And these depictions here are from Black Kirby artists, John Jennings and Stacey Robinson, Malcolm X in a science fiction way being Magneto from the X-Men, and MLK with Nichelle Nichols on the Starship Enterprise trying to find Sunrise Saturn in terms of, oh man, man, I'm sorry, you all didn't say anything, you all, okay. Okay, that was the previous slide, or one of them that I'll let you say, where I talked about foresight, insight, and oversight. Those points I made saying those are challenges for people, whether you're in the imaginary space or a policy-making space. Those three things, if you're in terms of second wave Afrofuturity, are to me at a minimum have to be present in terms of what you're either imagining in the near future or forecasting. Then I talk about these challenges for Black speculative futurity and Pan-African futurity, being recolonization, being a potential threat, the new reconfiguration. Back in the 60s, it was, the Cold War was between what? Soviet Union and the United States, and a lot of the third world, what they used to call the third world's reaction to this balance of power at the time. Digitization, miniaturization, simulation, the idea of the supernet and the AI of people who are concerned with artificial intelligence, and environmental crisis and resource depletion. And then finally, this idea of a convergence of culture and futurity that I previously mentioned, this clash of futurities, where in Africa now, like Ghana launched its first satellite earlier this year. Nigerians have their own space program, and other African countries have their own space programs. And how in the arts and visual arts and music, a lot of times when you're talking about Black speculative thought, they are so a reflection of social struggles going on at that time. For example, you don't have the Harlem Renaissance without the Garvey movement. You don't have the Black arts movement without the Black Power movement. And the Black speculative arts movement that is going on right now, you could say is a part of or a reflection of some of the struggles that have been in the streets around groups such as the Huey P. Newton Gun Club or the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is a time in the 21st century where certain ideas, or as I like the term Lewis talked about, futuristic ideas contesting old utopias. And so you're going to see that coming out in art, visual art, music, and so forth, as these tensions emerge over the next several years as this historical moment that everyone is transitioning through happens. And what I have there on the last slide, that is the work that is coming out here in the next few weeks. You'll see it. It's called Cosmic Underground, a Grimoire of Black Speculative Discontent, which is the compendium or of the work that was put together at the Unveiling Visions exhibition that we'll be posting pretty soon. So some of the concepts that really launched the Black speculative arts movement that were part of that exhibition will be in that volume with artists from all over the world, from Africa, some in Europe, all from the diaspora and the continent itself, along with essays. I don't know if Rasheedah is back yet, but More Mother made contributions to this. And we're very excited that we've finally been able to get this project out, and it should be out very soon. And I'll take questions at this time. Sorry for the technological glitches along the way. Well, I hope I didn't depress anybody. Okay.
Hi, this is just a clarification question.
Okay.
The ethno-astronomer, her name was?
The what?
Ethno-astronomer.
Oh, Jarita Holbrook.
Spell, please.
Jarita, spelled Jarita. Jarita Holbrook. 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 Holbrook.
Thank you.
I know one person I neglected to mention, but whose work I think is going to be is really interesting to look at. That comes to mind because he went to school with Jarita. Is Lonnie Brooks. He looks at this idea of forecasting and Afrofuture types in relation to algorithms and software. And Lonnie worked at a Silicon Valley think tank and talked about and identified the ways that software is used to forecast and exclude certain groups when people are making forecasts and in terms of predictions. And most people, like even in the entertainment industry, know that they use these algorithms to forecast what kind of movies will sell, what will be successful. They already do that in music and cinema. So they also have expanded this in other areas. And Lonnie is one of the people doing the groundwork, building upon Lisa Nakamura's work of cyber types, talking about Afrofuture types as a way of predicting outcomes for minorities. And Lonnie's work is influencing LGBT, in terms of how other groups are. And I always refer to, he's one of my literary contributors to our previous volume. I always refer to him by chapters. Oh, you're chapter 2, chapter 7, and so forth. And they were just an amazing group of writers for that volume. And the second follow-up volume to that book will be out also around the same time Cosmic Underground comes out. The Black Speculative Arts Movement, Black Futurity Art and Design will be out in the next few months also as a follow-up to the 2.0 volume that was released last year. Other questions?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for that. Could you speak a little more to the Dark Enlightenment, which you raised a couple of times?
Oh, okay.
Sorry, are you figuring it as something that's often described as a kind of a dystopic future, a right-wing future? Are you seeing it in your timeline as an opposition or as a material that it's still possible to work with?
What I'd see right now, I see it as, at least from an American context, there was I wish I could remember the name of it. It's based upon a lot of the ideas that come out of Silicon Valley right now related to this concept. And Mark Derry, as a cultural critic, talks about it much more elegantly than I do. But what they're really trying to do is return to this idea of a Jeffersonian democracy in terms of liberalism, but without the expense. They're not looking at Jeffersonian democracy was based on black bodies as commodities at the time. And this idea of surplus flesh in terms of how they don't want to deal with diversity or difference in a lot of their formulations. And one of the things why I think that project will collapse is they keep forgetting that, I'm going to try and say it elegantly, they don't have the same power to enforce their will they did, say, 100 years ago. Okay? For example, the American military is 40% people who are black, brown, and Asian. Okay? And they did a survey recently where these are, and they have generals and all this, and the number one problem the American military said was white supremacy, even in their own ranks, is a problem. And so this idea where the alt-right in our country, who might be somewhat attracted to these ideas, I believe Steve Bannon wrote some article talking about, for the alt-right, their ideas are like, and he's projecting the alt-right onto your own country, Greece. He said, this is like the struggle between Athens and Sparta. And I remember when I got to this country, I counted, I said, well, Athens, 5 million, Sparta, 50,000. Looks like Athens won in terms of certain ideas as it relates to the historical development of the country. So the idea of Athenian democracy ultimately surprised, even though white males like romanticizing about being 300 white guys that get slaughtered by Persians as a noble act. And this is how Steve Bannon and the alt-right see themselves. They're talking about blood and soil and things that you used to hear coming out of the Third Reich. And they are angry that Donald Trump's daughter married a Jew. And it was one of the concepts that came up in when I was in the West Bank in Israel this spring, the idea that Ivanka Trump, because she's married to Jared Kushner, now has the right of return to buy property in Israel because she married Jared Kushner, which the Palestinian intellectuals found is preposterous. And this idea of dark speculative futurity, if you look at the Old Testament as a mythology, where they say based upon these God-given rights, God gave us these lands as the Hebrew people, so the Palestinian intellectuals are going to start looking at things through a Canaanite mythology, lands of people who were there first, as a way of critiquing Hebrew mythology in relation to this idea of speculative futurity and some other things they're working with. But yeah, this idea of the Dark Enlightenment, where it's driven by techno-libertarianism, is a real thing. And you have people on the right and left of this issue. People of the margins now that live in American cities are talking about using cryptocurrency as a way of kind of going against central banks, the Federal Reserve in the United States. So right now we're kind of in that experimental phase of, okay, we have these imaginations, we've looked at these writings related to certain type of utopias. Well, now we got to answer the question, well, what kind of economy do we want? What kind of politics do we want? What kind of currency will we use? One of the things I tell people, if you want to look at a literary kind of example of future forces of production, Samuel Delaney's book Nova is a pretty good example of that. So I think that the next challenge for people engaged in speculative futurity, and I believe people like Kara Keeling and others are dealing with that, is, okay, what does this mean in terms of forces of production? How do we earn a living? How do we live if we create this future that we want? Because one of the things I remind people, where there's a lot of serious thought involved with this, people like H.G. Wells was a Fabian socialist, which was recommending a peaceful socialist transformation of British society. Now, America does not have a tradition of peaceful transformation. People are arguing that we're probably headed for a second civil war sometime in this century, based upon when you can't even agree on what the news is, or the truth is, or certain fact claims, and they cannot respond to the traditional Greek position of ethos, pathos, and logos. When you have an idiot as a president that talks about fake news and things being real facts, you have and whenever you have two irreconcilable sides, that's going to lead to conflict. So, however that manifests over the next couple of generations remains to be seen, even though some people might argue using Foucault or this panopticon thing of the surveillance society may prevent those groups from getting out to an all-out clash. You know, that remains to be seen what will be happening. So you could kind of say, though, at the heart of a lot of this reactionary stuff is Nick Land's vision. in terms of neoliberalism. And people like Emanuel Wallerstein and other people have argued that the way capitalism is structured can't go much beyond 2025, 2030, the way it works. I think in 2008, when all these central banks came together to put more liquidity into the international financial system, that was their last gasp to kind of make sure that the world global economy worked the way they wanted it to. It can't take another hit like that again. And that's why I argue when there's not enough food, water, and stuff to go around, groups will turn on each other in certain instances. They refer to the Mediterranean as the new Middle Passage now, where people are dying coming out of North Africa to get to Europe, even though what happened in North America was NATO's fault under the leadership of Barack Obama when they invaded Libya. And they used, and Italians and some of the other European powers were culpable in that. So everybody's now trying to shut down their borders. Israel with their wall, the United States thinking about building a stupid wall with Mexico. And people want to put up borders and fences now as though that's going to keep people from traveling across borders now. And as I mentioned this spring, Israel as a country is about the size of 3 American counties, very small. All it takes is one person with a virus to come into your country and it's over. And so that's why the walls are not going to be the solution. I think and I don't think, and a lot of professional futurists are arguing that they don't believe that global leadership will be able to transform their inner way of thinking and life swiftly enough to keep up with the change that's coming. Now, that's what the professional people have already said. So, now that hasn't trickled down to the masses yet to a certain extent. That's why I tend to be, like I said earlier, I kind of come from the House Slytherin part of what I think may or may not happen, but I could be wrong. But that's why I'm one of the Afrofuturists who, I have an imagination, but I still try to stay grounded in empirical reality where there are facts. I think it's a fact that we have global warming. That's a fact. We're living in technological acceleration for the next 20 years or so. That's a fact. And we're living in a period of globalization where I believe, according to Paul Virilio, that a population the size of Italy is crossing borders every day, that many millions of people. That's also a fact. And that the ethics, laws, and economics of our current system was never built or designed to deal with those facts. And as I said it with the G0 concept, there is no nation that is strong enough to compel everyone to work together anymore, to organize around these challenges. So now people have to draw upon their various imaginations of what could happen, what might happen. Are people going to have, I said, we live in a time of demagogues and prophets in terms of demagogues like a Trump or a Putin take advantage of the ignorance of people, or some of the prophetic people who will tell the truth and maybe get punished for it. So that's kind of where we are with, I guess, in relation to Nick Land. Yes?
Yeah, I've been trying to formulate something, but I think I have a simple question that should allow you to sort of expound broadly. Do you think then that Afrofuturism or Black speculative thought is a self-guided process to this balkanization you see?
Of course.
So it guides
it's a self-guided process. For instance, the empirical facts are, because I live in America, that's the society I know the best, even though I travel a lot. Facts are America, the resegregation of America has been going on since 1965. People are, whether they're online or in the real world, or organizing themselves into enclaves of like-minded people. Like for instance, where I live in Missouri, there are people, predominantly white, that take pride in the fact that they never have to even cross the St. Charles River to get to St. Louis, even though St. Louis is the economic engine that drives the state. Everyone wants and we don't have enough raw materials in the world for people to kind of just say, I want to build my own little utopia with 5 other people. When you talk about whether it's a digital footprint, economic footprint, or environmental footprint, where people can each build their own little whatever. in terms of using more than they need. And, Americans generally are the greediest people in the world, which is why our big behinds need bigger clothes to put on. And my wife complains I need to go to the track more often. But, yeah, people are not educated to share and think about their neighbor as much as they used to in terms of what's going to happen to them.
So I'm just thinking, though, in the context of the black radical tradition, certain aspects of the black radical tradition, you mentioned Garvey, there's a kind of thing about self-reliance here then.
Yes.
I see it now. Yeah. All right.
And I think out of that tradition, even though I know, because in the diaspora, nationalism means something different than it means in Europe. Okay? I hope I live long enough to see the British Commonwealth collapse. And I hope I live long enough to see the French kicked out of Africa. And so I think that that's going to require a Garveyistic type of movement to go on. And that's why, I think that process has already started. But it's a part of a process that really started, several generations ago. And that's why, I would say from a historical perspective, think of it like 100 Years' War. Post-World War II, it might take 3 or 4 generations, and certain generations, the same time African leaders are assassinated, MLK and Malcolm are assassinated. And so, we are now having another generation prepared to step up to the plate and take a risk to push this agenda going forward. One of the things that was clear to me when I talked to the Palestinian intellectuals, they were very much interested. It seems like this dark speculative futurity seems like it's really emerging on a Latin, African, Arabic axis, much the similar way what they used to call, some of the things that came out of the Bandung Conference in terms of some ideas about dealing with the future. And the thing is, I don't lightly say that, and it happened here in Europe because a lot of people argued in the 90s that liberalism had triumphed over communism. And that a lot of people, whether you lived in Greece, Great Britain, or North America, basically said your reward for this was democracy and liberalism and a certain way of life for not becoming communist. And now that perspective has collapsed under the weight of its own illusions that it could no longer deal with effectively as of 2008, or what people used to call the Washington Consensus about how international finance and politics should work. And that's why I often tell people that care to ask, Obama was the salesman for this project. Do you have used car salesmen in Greece? Do you? Okay, well, you got to think about Barack Obama as a used car salesman. He doesn't own the lot. He's just trying to sell you a product and make you think that it's greater than it is. And he was effectively able to get people to buy into that, as a way of stabilizing or maintaining social order. And then Donald Trump comes in and reminds you he's one of the people that owns the lot, okay, as a billionaire capitalist. And he was just communicating like they talk behind closed doors, but he's just crass enough to say it in public, what he actually thinks, And so that's where these rhetorical utterances of a lot of the leadership now, whether it's a Putin or a Trump or whatever, they're unable to mystify people anymore in terms of what the ultimate objectives are. I think they're just trying to mobilize populist passion around certain projects that maybe would have worked during the age of imperialism, but are no longer sustainable. Yes?
Thank you, Reynaldo. Thank you for your points. So, in the 70s, Stuart Hall used to say that race is the modality through which class is lived. And more and more, I think that pessimism is the mode through which futurity is lived. Futurity is, it's something that's been produced every day, but the everyday is lived in a mode which is pessimistic in relation to that futurity. And yesterday we were talking about, several modes of AP, several modes of Afro-pessimism, which seem to have quite a complex relation to both Pan-Africanism and Afrofuturism. So we can start to think in terms of at least three tendencies which operate in, say, the long century that you sketched out. You know, so that black speculative thought is taking place in three modes, not in one. It's taking place in the mode of Pan-Africanism, in the mode of Afro-pessimism, and in the mode of Afrofuturism. There's at least three things going on, and they're kind of intersecting all the time. And I wondered if you could say a bit about this question of the relation of pessimism to futurity, because I sense it's quite a profound. I sense that they are imbricated, they're entangled in some way.
I would say they are. I would say the people who tend to be more utopian don't like the idea of Afro-pessimism. But to me, Afro-pessimism, you know, looking at the work of Frank Welderson or and others, to a certain extent, lesser extent, Orlando Patterson, it keeps me grounded in reality. Because as a person who believes in objective empirical facts, I can objectively say in the world today, although there are individual black successes, whether it's a financial, business, or entrepreneurial or whatever, there is not a single black country or a country, one, where you see blacks and whites get along in any kind of serious way, or two, any black country that is not impacted by neocolonialism or other type of isms in relation to the world system. So my thing is, in a world of declining resources, environmental collapse, in a G0 world, you better get strong. And that's why for me, even though it might be, what's the German word, verboten, to always say in public, I would not be sad to see an African country get some nuclear armament. Because you can say what you want about North Korea. I was in the military, went up to the demilitarized zone. You're not just going to run up on them and take over their country without consequences, okay? And people they're trying to jazz Americans up to be angry at North Korea. Korea has no, in their long history, when you call it the Hermit Kingdom, of invading anybody, okay? So this idea that they're basically going to hold on to these weapons because they've been invaded over the course of their history by Russians, Chinese, Japanese. So they're not just thinking of Americans. That's just some rhetoric we got going back and forth since South Korea is one of our client states that we use to maintain capitalism in the Pacific area, as America is moving away from its responsibilities in Europe and the Middle East to confront its competitor China in Asia. So it is what they would call, intellectuals call, America's Asian pivot. And however, there is also, you can find the document online, an African pivot that America is engaged into to continue to keep Africa as a resource to help keep Europe stabilized with access to raw materials and resources and cheap labor. Okay.